Good evening. I'm Dick Clay, and I'm the President and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. I'm so glad you're able to join us this evening for tonight's presentation. 9 days, the race to save Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and win the 1960 election, with Stephen Kendrick and Paul Kendrick. Stephen Kendrick is the author of Holy Clues, The Gospel According to Sherlock Holmes, and Night Watch, a novel. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Hartford Courant, American Heritage, Huffington Post, and Utne Reader. He's a graduate of Princeton University and then the Harvard Divinity School. His son, Paul Kendrick, is a writer living in Chicago whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, American Heritage, Talking Points Memo, and the Huffington Post. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. For now, please join me in welcoming Stephen Kendrick and Paul Kendrick for what promises to be a really interesting presentation. Stephen and Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Paul and I are delighted to be with you tonight. Kentucky means a lot to us, and history means a lot to us. The Kendrick family has deep roots in Winchester, Kentucky, and my mother, the Roselle family, and the Bird family had their roots in Lexington. And during much of my childhood, I was a counselor at Camp Daniel Boone on the banks of the Kentucky River. When I came to bury my father in Lexington, my wife and I took a quick journey up and to see the home of Joshua Speed, which is a place I'd always wanted to see in Louisville. And so Kentucky just means so much. And we're delighted to be invited by the Filson Historical Society to present our book. We're often asked, how does a father and son, how did they come to work together? When Paul went off to college, our family moved to Boston. We went on a denominational tour to Tennessee, where I also grew up. And we went to Memphis, and my son said, you know, Dad, yeah, we can have ribs, but we're not going to Graceland. We're going to the brand new opening of the National Civil Rights Museum. And I said, okay, let's do it. We rented a car, and there we were. And as we drove into the parking lot, I realized I'd seen this place before. It was, of course, the Lorraine Motel where King was assassinated in Memphis. And there really our mutual passion for writing books together was born, because we saw a timeline of the civil rights movement in American history. And we saw a story based in Boston of a father who sued the Boston School Board, and then went all the way to Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And then eventually, more than 100 years later, it became an integral part of Brown versus Board of Education. We wrote a book called Sarah's Long Walk. And it was about how Boston integrated its schools in 1845, long before other urban areas, and the story that was created by the interaction of white and black in Boston. And we realized that there was always a story to tell in American history of those rare moments, and they are more rare than they should be, where white and black can work fruitfully together, where there's just an opening and people can find a way somehow to create something positive and good in the midst of our mutual tragedy of race, and sometimes discomprehension and uncomprehension between us, and ways in which we can find a path to work together. And then we later wrote a book called Douglas and Lincoln. Many people assumed that we were talking about Lincoln's great debating partner Stephen Douglas, but no, we were talking about Frederick Douglass. And that was a wonderful project to work on. And in the back of our minds, we were always looking for a third project, kind of a trilogy, if you will. And when we moved to Boston, we also lived next door to a terrific neighbor who said one day, you know, you really should meet my friend Harris Wofford. He was a former Pennsylvania senator. He was integral in the voluntarization of private citizens in American life. And he turned out to be the connective person between John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. He was the person who tied them together. This is a picture of Harris Wofford that we took in 2017. We were really privileged to sit down and meet with Harris. And Paul interviewed him many, many occasions. And in meeting Harris, a story began to develop that we thought needed to be told. The story of the 1960 election is American mythology. It's commonly recognized to be one of the most exciting and closest elections in American history. There have been closer elections, but this was the last election that was close in every section of the country, in virtually every state of the union. It was just close every week as Nixon and Kennedy moved towards election day. The slightest mistake could make all the difference. Kennedy had created something they called the Civil Rights Section, the CRS. They wanted to appeal to Black voters in a new way, in the guise not just of payoffs and working with urban centers and trying to sort of manipulate the system, but really to work through the burgeoning and growing and creatively unfolding creative civil rights movement. And students all across the South were beginning the sit-ins right before the election. This is a story really, as we discovered it through Harris's eyes, a story of really young people. Harris Wofford was in his mid-30s. Martin Luther King was only 31 years old, and JFK and Nixon were in their early 40s. So these are relatively young men who are, in a sense, in a collision course towards history, not just of the election, but as we learned this story in a deeper way, we realized that this was the point, that when Martin Luther King was arrested at the demonstration connected to the sit-in movement all across the South, when he was arrested in his hometown of Atlanta, less than 3 weeks before the election, it would be the time that his family was most concerned for his life. And I'm going to turn this story over to Paul. There's a lot of fascinating people in this story. There's Sergeant Shriver, and there's a man named Louis Martin, who Paul will tell you about, who is one of the, I think, forgotten heroes of American history. He's sometimes known as the Black Godfather of American politics. He was a president whisperer. He was not only an advisor to Kennedy, but also to Johnson, and was brought onto Jimmy Carter's staff as well. And the amazing thing about Louis Martin, who was not a politician, but a newspaper editor, is he just had an uncanny ability to work behind the scenes to make things happen. He was responsible for getting Thurgood Marshall onto the Supreme Court. And in many ways, he was the linchpin, along with Harris Wofford and along with Sergeant Shriver. These three essentially went rogue and helped save Martin Luther King's life when he was imprisoned in the Reidsville penitentiary. And Paul has a story to tell you. When we first proposed this book to FSG, Forrest Group, we said that we have a fast-paced legal thriller to give you. And indeed, it is 9 days where so much is at stake, not just the presidency itself, but the life of Martin Luther King. So, Paul?
Thank you. Yeah, as my father said, it was a treasure to spend time with Harris Wofford and record his stories. And for Harris, Martin Luther King was is not the monument that I know, and in black and white footage, it was his friend who he missed, and so we did find that this was a story that had to be told. And Harris was a very uncommon fellow. He had gotten obsessed with Gandhiism and thought about how that could be brought to America. He went to Howard Law School, first white graduate of it. His grandmother fainted when he said he was going to do this, but he wanted to change America through nonviolence, civil disobedience, but he knew he had to ground himself in a community that was not his, and to better understand the realities, to work on racism in America. And he had heard about a young minister, a 26-year-old minister in Montgomery, Alabama, putting this nonviolent civil disobedience into action. So he started writing letters to Martin Luther King, and he became a friend and advisor to King. But he also had a connection to John Kennedy, and so he went to work on the 1960 campaign, and there's where he finds himself in this very unique position of a friend of Martin Luther King's, an advisor in the civil rights movement, who is working on a presidential campaign. And so this was Harris with President Kennedy on the South Lawn to take us back in time. And so I was recording these stories, and my father and I were spending time with Harris, knowing this was an incredible story to make a full book, to tell a self-contained story about it with characters that have been overlooked. And we got really interested in Harris's partner on the campaign, Louis Martin. And my father told you a bit about Louis. Louis has just been kind of left out of history for someone who was really critical to orchestrating a lot in the 1960s. And he got brought onto the Kennedy campaign because, well, Harris had been put in charge of winning the black vote, and he was not doing very well at that task as a kind of well-intentioned white liberal, but he didn't really know people in communities to help him really make this happen. And he and his boss, Sergeant Shriver, who I'll talk about more, recruited a Chicago Defender editor named Louis Martin, who would be this key strategist on the Kennedy campaign, and is kind of at the heart of the book. And with Louis Martin, I started going to the Library of Congress and found just a treasure trove of his papers, of his journals and recollections from his life, and especially this Kennedy campaign, and kind of became friends with his daughters, who shared our sense that their father was a great American hero that ought to be better known. And so the affectionate friendship of Harris and Louis, but then the audacious kind of electoral machinations that they undertake for Kennedy to help Martin Luther King would be at the heart of the book. And their boss, to complete this trio, Sergeant Shriver, you may know that name, but the Kennedy in-law, who was married to Kennedy's sister, Eunice, and was very passionate about things like defeating racism in America. And so was sometimes viewed a little warily by the Kennedy family. What was his judgment going to be? But he was in charge of the different constituency outreaches. And so Harris, Louis, and Shriver would be this team of kind of civil rights mavericks who would change an election. But then we got really interested in kind of the other side of the story one of the other sides of the story in terms of the Atlanta civil rights movement, and known as the Atlanta student movement. And so this is Lonnie King. We took this in his living room in the precious afternoons that we spent with him recording his stories. Sadly, Lonnie and Harris Wofford both passed away in 2019, but we're so grateful for the time we spent with them. And Lonnie King, he started a student movement because he heard about the sit-in in North Carolina. He said to Julian Bond, "Do you think someone's going to do that here?" And Julian Bond said, "I'm sure someone will." And Lonnie said, "All right, we'll call a meeting for tonight. You take that side of the cafeteria, I'll take this side of the cafeteria." And in a great lesson in just getting things going, taking action, Lonnie started organizing and helping the women and men of Spelman and Morehouse, Black Atlanta college students, to do sit-ins, to put their lives on the line, to try to force Americans to grapple with the wrong of segregation and to try to integrate Atlanta and Georgia and beyond. And so Lonnie, no relation to Martin Luther King, but he grew up in Martin Luther King's church. Martin Luther King's father was his minister. And Lonnie and the other survivors of the Atlanta student movement who knew King well help us give you in this book a more human way to know Martin Luther King, because he had the Montgomery bus boycott success at 26 years old. And they helped me understand this period of his life that I didn't really know before, but he kind of spent a few years really searching for how, and kind of struggling with how he was going to change America, with some kind of false starts in the movement. And Martin Luther King was worried about being a one-hit wonder, and people were now looking at him to unlock this, legal caste system in America. How are you going to do that? And so in 1960, Martin Luther King moved home to Atlanta, kind of go home, minister with his father, have Atlanta as his home base. And at this time, the sit-in movement is exploding, and Lonnie and the students say to King, "We want you to go to jail with us," because they were so frustrated in watching a campaign of Kennedy and Nixon where the candidates weren't talking about their issue of civil rights, of college students all over the South doing these sit-ins. And they thought if their emergingly famous friend went to jail with them, people would have to talk about that. And they had been inspired by King and the Montgomery bus boycott, but now they had a new spin on nonviolence. And Dr. King had never spent a night in jail before. And so they really it was time for him to put his body on the line for the movement. You'll learn about why that was an agonizing decision for King, why his father didn't want him to go to jail. And the second chapter is kind of about this decision. But Lonnie keeps the pressure on, and King eventually says yes. But to help kind of set the stage for what happens in these 9 days, it's really important to remember that Nixon was the friend of King. The King family was planning to vote for Nixon. Black Atlanta voted Republican. And in general, it was seen that the Black vote might split about 50-50. Black voters were really we're just very open and looking at which candidate is going to be better for me, which candidate can I trust more, would support civil rights. And Nixon, this is a picture of him and King meeting in Ghana when it became an independent country. Nixon had really taken time to befriend King. He had King to his office to talk about legislation. They exchanged some pretty heartfelt letters. And so the students thought Nixon would be the one who spoke up for them when they went to jail. And I talked about the Kennedy civil rights team. Nixon had some really equally strong Black advisors, Jackie Robinson, the baseball legend, who you see here, and a man named E. Frederick Morrow, who was a really, I think, interesting character in the book that a lot of folks may not know about. He was the first Black White House staffer in the Eisenhower administration. And so you see in the book that, Robinson and Morrow really have a vision for the party of Lincoln, really Black voters coming home to the Republican Party being, really leading on civil rights, and Nixon, again, if he can get over 50% of the Black vote, he's going to be in the White House. And that's where it's looking like it's going to go 3 weeks before the election, before everything is really upended. So on October 19th, 1960, Dr. King joins more than 50 students who are arrested at Rich's department store in Atlanta, the crown jewel department store of the South. They go to the Magnolia Tea Room, asked to be served. They are arrested. Here's our friend Lonnie. You can see he was a football player at Morehouse, so you can see he's a lot bigger and stronger than Dr. King, and a young woman, Marilyn Price, and Blondie Norbert, as King is being taken off to jail for that arrest. But something happens that really escalates the danger pretty soon. Dr. King did not understand that he was on probation because he had been racially profiled a couple months before and given a ticket for not having yet gotten his Georgia license. He still had an Alabama license. He and Coretta were driving a white friend of the movement, Lillian Smith, who was a great Southern writer, to her cancer treatments, and gets pulled over, given this ticket, and put on probation. And this racist judge in DeKalb County, once King goes to jail in Atlanta, in Fulton County, says he has to appear in my courtroom. This violates the terms of his probation, and I can revoke it and send him to state prison. And so a few days into the book, after what is initially kind of a, Lonnie described to us as like a nonviolence retreat in the jail, and the camaraderie of these students doing this, despite the incredible danger that, especially the women students had to face down in these jails, at least they are together. The students, as you find out in the book, are released from jail. King is kept and here he is being taken to a trial in DeKalb County from Fulton. Here he is heading into the courtroom in Decatur. And King had an outstanding lawyer who's another great American hero for us to learn about in the book, Donald Hollowell, who bravely argued in court how absurd it was that these totally respectful, nice dressed students, why would they not be served and someone else served, and just trying to point out really the moral wrong of these laws. But Judge Oscar Mitchell doesn't want to hear it. He sentences Dr. King to 4 months in Reidsville State Prison. King is woken up. Dr. King thought he would never see his family, and again, as he's driven across Georgia in a harrowing night for himself. So Coretta is then calling her friend Harris Wofford on the Kennedy campaign, saying, they're going to kill Martin. I know they're going to kill him. And Harris had, you learn in the book how Harris had already kind of gotten the campaign involved in this case in an unsanctioned way. But now Coretta is really pushing Harris to escalate the involvement and the boldness of what they're going to do. And so Harris and Louis, they've been trying to get press releases out, but they go out for a beer and they're just like, what's a press release going to do? What more can we do here? For Harris, this is his friend whose life is in danger, who's heading for 4 months on a chain gang where King's father was told by powerful people, they'll just quietly kill your son. And so Harris, and this picture of Coretta and Bobby is from King's funeral 8 years later, but Harris and Louis, Harris says, what if Kennedy just called her? And Louis just seizes on that idea that would really do something for people like me. That would, because it would show the candidate's heart. They get this idea to Shriver, who will wait until Kennedy's advisors are out of the room so that Kennedy can pick up the phone and do something that they didn't think was going to change American politics, but was just a decent thing to do for a scared, pregnant wife. But, notwithstanding the potentially politically explosive ramifications, because Kennedy is trying to hold on to the South. Nixon believes he might be able to flip the Democratic South, but Kennedy needs to hold it, and he's now calling the wife of this controversial activist. And so from there, you learn more in the book of how Kennedy was not just satisfied with a gesture. Ultimately, he and Bobby work back channels to the governor and eventually to the judge to solve the problem, to get King out. And it's almost like a spy thriller. We didn't have to manipulate the story to do that. That's just kind of, there's just a lot that Americans did not know and have not known for a long time of how Kennedy and Bobby worked behind the scenes to ultimately get King home. And this is the students waiting for him with his family. It's I think a very moving moment, that you can read about in the book, of how they got him home on a little plane, and how the students who loved him because he had supported them, how they were waiting for him. Here's a picture of Coretto and the family with King. But from there, Louis Martin thought, I don't think Black voters have really focused in on this sufficiently. And he has an idea to do a little pamphlet that tells the story of Kennedy calling Coretto and Richard Nixon not speaking up for King. And Louis shares this idea with Harris. Harris immediately backs it. They call Shriver. And by this point in the book, Louis and Harris had been told not to do a single another thing on this campaign. They had been told by Bobby Kennedy they may have lost this campaign. They've lost these Democratic Southern governors. That they got them just exposed in this politically explosive situation. You do nothing further. And so instead, Shriver says, we're not going to tell my brothers-in-law. Let's just do it. And it's called the Blue Bomb because they printed millions of pamphlets, and Louis, through his Chicago Defender background, knew how to tell a story, and then he knew how to distribute it because he knows the Black newspaper editors, the political leaders in all these cities. And so the genius of the Blue Bomb is that the white voters who they did not want to know about what Kennedy had done for the controversial minister activist would not focus in on the story. And the last few days of the election, the people are focused on other issues. But the people they wanted to reach read this story. And ultimately, there's a really critical 7 percentage point shift from how Eisenhower did in '56 to the Democratic Party. And Kennedy is narrowly elected. We think Black voters made a difference for him at least 9 states, because as my dad said, the 1960 election is so fascinating because it's just close in every state. It's not just like a few battlegrounds. It was just like a few thousand votes everywhere. And so this critical Black vote moving to Kennedy is the beginning of this kind of, or part of this larger realignment of American politics that's ultimately going to happen, helps Kennedy get to the White House. And from there, Harris and Louis would be working behind the scenes to make Kennedy live up to the trust that Black voters put in him to support civil rights. And that wouldn't be an easy journey, but that's another story. But for King, Andrew Young told us that what King faced down that night on that drive across Georgia to rural Reidsville, King would say to his advisors in Birmingham, you haven't been to the death's door like I have. But once King did that, he could go on to do what his mission entailed. He fully accepted the terms of what it was going to take to change America. And it was going to take, in Birmingham, him facing down solitary confinement. It was going to take risking his life. But in King's activism in Birmingham, where he really brings everything together in a genius of moral theater, that's where the public, the American public, he's able to help them see civil rights as an urgent crisis that must be solved, and hearts and minds are moved to support that. And that moves Kennedy behind civil rights legislation that Louis had been pushing him to be bolder on. And so, in the story, you get to know these characters that you may not know well, but through their eyes, we see these characters that we do know of, but you get to see in a more human way, and it helps you learn a critical piece of the civil rights movement, our U.S. political history, but again through characters that through our interviews and the research in the oral histories, the newspapers, we want to make it as vivid as possible, and history that we hope is ultimately inspiring, because just the nature of the story is the characters that were bold and spoke up against an injustice, that is ultimately rewarded, and that ultimately, when going back to Lonnie King and the Atlanta student movement, they were brilliantly able to realize the change that they hoped to make in America. So, Stephen, I'll let you take it from there.
Well, I just want to make a couple points, and then we want to get a lot of time for your questions, because that's actually the part we enjoyed the most. So this is, in a sense, an origin story. This is a Martin Luther King that we don't know. He's not the iconic, great, mythic figure. He's a relatively young man who doesn't really understand quite what his role is, but he does have an intuitive understanding that he has a vision, a nonviolent vision, that might have the capacity to unlock the sort of America's original sin, as it's sometimes described. And so a filmmaker in King's life was once interviewing him, and he wanted to make a movie. And he said, so how does the movie end? And King looked at him, he said, well, it ends with me being killed. I mean, King did not want to be a martyr. He had his whole life before him. He had lots of opportunities to step away. He was offered, heads of seminaries and professorships in England, and he could have walked away, but he just packed his bag and went on. Once in Chicago, which he said was actually a lot worse than his Southern campaigns, he was on a march and a rock struck him, and he collapsed to the ground and then got back up. And he said, people really have to understand what it takes, the power of redemptive suffering. And so, we're so used to the idea of people who protest or go to jail, pictures of people behind the bars, and it's kind of a moral cliche. But in 1960, you would have to be almost certifiably insane to be a Black man and go behind bars. It's a classic Stephen Biko kind of phenomenon. If a young boy named Emmett Till could be killed, what was King going to experience on that long Stations of the Cross ride to Reidsville? And so when the students came up with the idea of jail, no bail, it really was an ultimate clarion call. And King understood that his comfortable role was going to have to change. He was going to have to go to jail, and he would go to jail more than 25 times in the next 8 years of his life. And you dared something. You were putting your life on the line. And that was one thing. When we first conceived of the book, we really thought that our heroes were going to be Harris and Sergeant Shriver and Louis Martin. And in some sense they are. We see much of the book through their eyes. But the truth of the matter is, our estimation of King rose because we understood that he was not just a figure on the chessboard. He had to make a definitive decision that he would go to jail. And yeah, it's true, he didn't understand how dangerous it was going to be. But any Black man would understand that if you put yourself in the hands of justice, you may not get justice. So King becomes really an important figure in a way that we hadn't quite counted on. Paul was able to find a transcript of the trial that had been missing for more than 40 years. We found letters of Nixon's Black advisors who kept crying out to him, say something, do something, because if the Kennedy campaign gets ahead of us on this, we're going to pay a heavy price. But Nixon was silent. And Nixon would be, in fact, silent. King and Kennedy, Martin Luther King and Richard Nixon would never speak again. And they exchanged, we believe, only one letter. They sundered their tradition. And instead of the vision that Morrow and Jackie Robinson had of a Republican Party that could go toe-to-toe with the Democratic Party, instead, there was the creation of the Southern strategy. You can make a case it's been a wildly successful strategy, but it's also been a problem in the life of America. Wouldn't it be better if somehow each political party could speak to the totality of the nation and ask for their vote and ask for their moral vision of what it means to be a democracy. A king's dream was that he would endorse no candidate, but each candidate would instead try their very best to come to terms with the issue of race in American life. And that was his vision, and I think it's a good vision. It's one we're very far from. So, in writing this book, we were really taken aback by the idealism and the morality of the characters in the book. They were, in almost all cases, really decent and good people. And we all have this vision inside ourselves that politicians are pretty venal and corrupt and all that. But this was one of those, perhaps rarer than it should be, moments where people did the right thing. Kennedy did not have to pick up the telephone and call Coretta Scott King on the way to another event. For him, it was not 1 minute and a half phone call in the midst of a busy, long 12-hour campaign day, but he did it. He did the decent thing. And Bobby Kennedy didn't have to call the judge. In fact, you could make the case that his calling the judge, in fact, was probably not great in terms of legal ethics, but he did it. And King walked free. And the next 8 years, if King had died here in 1960, there would have been no Selma, there would have been no Birmingham, there would have been no March on Washington, and there would have been no Memphis. And so in many ways, so much of American history ends up being crowded into these 9 days in ways that were surprising to us, in ways that kind of gave us a thrill that somehow packed into this brief moment where so much was at stake. Yes, a presidency. Who was going to be president? But much more was at stake than that. It was, in a sense, the moral core of who we are as a people and who we could be, So writing the book was an absolute thrill. We have been so pleased at the reaction. Paul and I have published books, and we've always been happy for whatever reaction we get. If you write a book, you know that it's a tough go, but it's a thrill too. And in this case, we've got reviews and attention, and the idea of presenting to historical societies like you really give us a charge. And we really, really do appreciate it, because we, like you, love history, and we think and know how important history really is in understanding ourselves. History is not just the past. History is what is unfolding and has brought us to this moment. And we can't understand the moment unless we can come to terms with our history. That's what Paul and I tried to do. And now we look forward to your questions. And so, Julie, are you our question person?
Stephen, can you hear me? It's Dick.
Yes.
All right.
Indeed,
and,
yes.
Thank you both so much. This was really wonderful.
Thank you.
And, I think at the Filson, one of the things that motivates us to go to work every day and really be excited about what we do is the sense that by collecting, preserving, and telling history, we build democracy. I do have a question that I'll start with, and that is the effect of all of this on Nixon. Did he ever, looking back, voice regrets on not being more of an activist in this? And did President Eisenhower, whose appointments to the federal bench in the South were and are the stuff of which legends are made because they were so important in the civil rights movement, did he ever indicate any regrets that his vice president had not done something here?
Yeah, good question, Dick. And I just want to thank you for all your leadership in preserving history and sharing it. And Scott, I want to thank you for your work as well. So just, again, it's such an honor to be with you. Great question. So Eisenhower just referred to it once very dismissively of, I couldn't believe a few phone calls could change an election. And I think both he and Nixon, there's some evidence that they felt that they had done, they had a good civil rights record that shouldn't have been, that they felt, kind of upset and in a sense that Black voters had kind of thrown that out because of a couple of phone calls. So, and with Nixon, he had a really interesting interview in Ebony or Jet a few years later, where he's creating kind of these different rationalizations, like, I thought, I wanted to, I was trying to work behind the scenes to help get him out, and I didn't think it was proper for Bobby to do what he did and making a call to a judge, and I didn't, I had just done a lot of work, and we need to do more work as a Republican Party to, we can't be an all-white party. We have to reach Black voters. And I thought I had done a lot of good work. But I think you read the interview, it comes off a little as kind of grappling with a rationalization because, his friend needed him and he didn't speak up. But the best window, or an interesting window we have into his emotions, was in the Nixon library. There was a telegram, kind of a note after the election from one of his advisors that we found with the Nixon library files, tons of telegrams from Black leaders and NAACP chapters around the country saying, "Speak out for King, speak out for King, help get King out, help me." We found a lot of evidence, letters from Morrow, different things. There's no question Nixon was getting the advice that he ought to, at least make a strong public statement for King. But someone sends him a note and says, "Hey, maybe it might be nice to respond to those people that contacted you about this, saying you're glad he's out, and that was what you wanted." And there's just 2 letters scrolled on it that just says "no." And to us that seemed to be a little bit of a window into a pain in Nixon that, feeling maybe a rejection from these voters, or just that, he had gotten a bad deal with it all. But, we think a critical moment was when he comes to Georgia in August and he sees hundreds of thousands of voters out for him. And he received letters of people saying, that the South is your future. You can win these states that had voted Democrat for decades. And so there's some different evidence that we have in the book from other people that were working on the campaign that suggest, he just thought there was just a lot of political downside for speaking up for King, and it was just too explosive to touch. And that was really painful to Morrow and Robinson, who wanted him to speak out and wanted this moment to really capture the vision they had for the party. So so that was kind of our sense of it. And then, and then there's stuff that's come out of super racist rants, he made in the White House and things. And so the Nixon that you meet at the start of the book seems to, you don't know whether that was real or not, that friendship with King. King said once that if Nixon just is so, earnest and when he's with you, but if he's not honest, then could be the most dangerous man in America, because Nixon had done, had spoken out against segregation, had befriended King and told Morrow he's going to make gains on civil rights if he wins the presidency. He had a better record on civil rights and race than John Kennedy heading into the 1960 election, and that's why a lot of Black voters were planning to vote for him. He had he was frustrated the civil rights bill in 1957 was watered down by Democrats like John Kennedy and the segregationists. So he had this record, but it just feels like later that got lost, and that Nixon, whether it was real or not, is not in the Nixon that, just said, terrible things about Black people, like during his presidency, that were recorded in the notes of his advisors later, and then obviously used a lot of kind of dog whistles to capture a reaction against civil rights progress and a backlash that people were feeling.
Ultimately leading, I guess, to the Southern strategy that your dad referenced. Here's another question. Please tell us more about the continued relationship between Dr. King and President Kennedy once President Kennedy was in office.
Go ahead. One of the things we write about, can I take this, Paul?
Yeah.
There's a sense of this myth that the Kennedy brothers are like super liberals. And in fact, they were deeply, deeply conservative and hesitant, and drove civil rights leaders mad because they understood that so much was at stake. And every time that the civil rights movement needed a jolt and needed to move forward, whether it was the Freedom Riders or whatever, the events of Birmingham, they wondered, would JFK come through? Would RFK from the Department of Justice come through? They did sometimes, and they didn't sometimes, and they were deeply ambivalent. Once JFK took Harris Wofford aside and said, "Get your friends off the buses. This is a problem in terms of my conducting my presidency in foreign affairs. The civil rights movement is killing me." And it was true. It was beginning to affect his poll ratings. But when push came to shove in 1963, before Kennedy's assassination, Kennedy articulated a vision in a speech after the events of Birmingham that literally brought tears to King's eyes. And then the relationship with RFK went on a great deal longer. And it would be very interesting to see how that would have eventually played out. Again, they had hesitancy, they were wary of each other, but they could work together. In the end, it makes perfect sense historically that a Southerner like Johnson would be able to get the Civil Rights Bill through, whereas a Massachusetts politician who had a frankly terrible record in civil rights would actually have problems. So they both had an interesting relationship with the Kennedy brothers that really goes beyond the myth.
Here's a question. How was Dr. King ultimately released from this first prison?
Well, so the first prison he was in is in Fulton County, Georgia, in Atlanta. And so that's where the students were released. And King was DeKalb County kind of seized custody of King and brought him to their jail where he had the hearing. And then from there, he's sentenced to state prison and taken out to Reidsville in rural Georgia. So he was in 3 jails in the 9 days. And in terms of how the students were released, so Harris did actually call someone who goes to see the mayor and is trying to get King out back when he was in Atlanta. And Harris had done this without any kind of permission for the campaign. So it's the first time in the book Harris gets in trouble because the mayor of Atlanta says, well, candidate John Kennedy, Senator Kennedy is interested in resolving the situation. And the Kennedy campaign is, the higher ups are like, what? We didn't do anything like this. But it was because Harris had started making some phone calls. But there were negotiations that the mayor of Atlanta, who was a real racial moderate at the time, William Hartsfield, he negotiates with the older Black leaders and the students to get the students out. But at that point, DeKalb had kind of claimed custody of this troublemaker minister who they thought had, did not like what he was bringing home to Georgia and in his civil rights movement. And so, but then in terms of how he's released from Reidsville, it's, Bobby, the call that, you have to kind of read it through in the book because it's kind of complicated, but essentially that JFK sets in motion some relationships with these different Georgia political insiders that leads to a call of Bobby to Judge Mitchell. But at the same time, King's lawyer, Donald Hollowell, and the lawyers he was working with found kind of a technicality that would allow him to be released, that there was like still time for an appeal from his previous sentence because there was a holiday in there. So Hollowell was doing his best, and he found what helped give the judge cover to ultimately kind of do a favor to his party, because again, the judge and the and Governor Vandiver, they're all Democrats, and the Democratic Party is kind of heading for a real kind of turning point on civil rights, but they they're told this is a problem for our party. You put Martin Luther King in jail, black voters don't like this, and you need to get him out. And the Georgia politicians don't like Martin Luther King, but they're like, all right, well, maybe if I do a favor for John Kennedy, they'll stop bothering us on trying to integrate our schools and whatnot. But it would ultimately be King's civil rights movement that would move the Kennedy to fully support civil rights after the kind of the long struggle that my dad alluded to. King wanted Kennedy to feel civil rights more viscerally. Kennedy was very intellectual about these things. He saw racism as kind of a puzzling kind of problem, but King wanted him to feel it, and Birmingham helped Kennedy make before he died feel it.
Can you tell us more about the research process and how you were able to find this information and the discoveries you were most proud of? I assume finding the trial transcript was one of them. Tell us about it.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So the trial transcript thing was amazing because I mentioned Donald Hollowell, and so his papers. He passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, before we had the idea to do this book, and would have loved to talk to him. But his papers were just opened at a library in Atlanta, Sweet Auburn Avenue Library, and in his papers was a copy that he had clearly used for writing the appeal and stuff, but it was kind of but it was a copy of the transcript of what happened in King's hearing, and that was doubly valuable. Yeah,
it was all messed up, and this is the only transcript that we have. Historians have been missing it and looking for it for a long, long time.
Yeah. And it was also really valuable because there were all these testimonies of what happened during the sit-in. So that helps us in the third chapter tell the story of King's arrest in I think a very kind of novelistic way, but it's the facts are all from the transcript as well as the Atlanta papers. So we were really, really proud of that. And then the interviews and sadly 5 different people we communicated with have passed away since we did so, but it made us feel very fortunate to have had this idea and to have friends like Lonnie King and Harris Wofford to record their stories, make sure they're preserved for history, and placed in the context of a story where those that had been behind the scenes are kind of brought to the fore. And so, but the Kennedy Library, the Nixon Library, as I said, the newspapers were so key. I love history. It's fun to me to pull out some microfilm, read the paper on October 19th, 1960 in Atlanta, or the students' newspaper. They had one called the Atlanta Inquirer. And I just love going into another world of everything that was going on that day. And so, we try to have that kind of color in the book, and especially as it builds to the election itself that was so close. And so Kennedy's here, Nixon's here, they're speaking there, Louis heading home to Chicago and he's with his family. And we were proud that Louis' daughters shared stories that helped us, bring him to life as a character. And then, as I said, the oral histories, and then Louis' papers. But it's so valuable, the preservation of history, because, there are great interviews with some of these different characters that were on YouTube or that's in the presidential libraries that were valuable for those who we didn't get to talk to, or some different universities that we used. But then we got to add to it with the interviews that we did with people. And it's been one of the most gratifying things that has happened from the book is Reverend Otis Moss, who became a great spiritual leader in America, but was one of the student leaders. When he called me after I'd sent him a copy of the book, he just loved it. He wants, Americans to read it and know the story for a long time to come. But he said it's brought back more memories because you made me feel like I was back with my friends, and that meant a lot to us because we want you to really feel it as a reader. You learn a lot of history of, like I said, like the realignment of the American political parties and stuff, but you do it through a good story.
Tell us, if you're willing, more about the writing process and how you took this research to get to this narrative. And I'll gloss that question, so to speak, with having practiced law for 42 years. In a firm, and I've seen certainly other firms as well, where fathers and sons have practiced together. And I know that remarkable and marvelous collaborations can take place. And I also know that there can be rather strong disagreements. Talk to us, if you would, about, and especially
I think it's
the
fair
fact that
to
Father's
say that-
Day, what's that?
Father's
Remember,
Day, yeah.
Father's Day was Sunday.
This is
That's
this
right.
is our third. This is our third book together, and each book has been really, really different. The first book we did, Paul spent an entire summer reading old, incredibly rare newspapers in the Boston Athenaeum, and he did a gargantuan amount of research. And I took the lead in terms of basic writing, and that's okay. In the second book we did, Paul's name is first because he wrote probably 60% of the book, and he really, got traction as a writer and as a father. Nothing could be more exciting and happy for me than to see your son develop as an historian and as a writer who has good writerly instincts of when to end a chapter, when to bring up a character, how to design the narrative arc of a book so that it works as a book. And then in this book, I think it was kind of equal in that I had the initial vision and wrote the proposal, and Paul did the boatload of incredible granular research. And we had really great editors at FSG, and they contributed to the voice. So, and I rewrote a lot of what Paul wrote, and then Paul would rewrite me, and then our editors would rewrite both of us. So by the time we went through a 1.5-year process, when I look at the book, it has its own unique voice. I can't tell what I wrote, can't really tell what Paul wrote. It became truly a united effort. And I think, yeah, that's great that a father and son can do that. But the truth of the matter is, it's the interaction with the editors and also the history. The people that we had talking to us, they helped write the book too. Their voice, their vision, their memories. We're just trying to honor that and be true to what they told us and what they told the oral interviews, what they left. Paul is right. It's very different, when he wrote the book, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, you work with what you work with. Here we are actually watching films, interviews. It made a world of difference to bringing the texture of this novelistic story to life. But one thing we want to emphasize is we didn't have to torture or manipulate the story. This was the way it was. And in being true to the way that the 9 days worked out, it had its own very powerful narrative thrust. And that was the exciting thing to put together. I think Paul and I just got a thrill, getting a sense of this is a unique and powerful story that has its own narrative like a locomotive. Getting to get King out and electing a president. There's just a heck of a lot at stake at this book.
Yeah, and I think a key of working together well is just that we have kind of no egos and are willing to have the other one cut things that we thought were really great. But yeah, the magic of Google Docs is that from a distance, we can both be, collaborating on it. And so, yeah, but we really like talking about kind of structure, and we were really challenged on this book because we had good editors.
It's an outstanding publishing house.
Oh, definitely. Well, we were really, really blessed to work with FSG, and they would you just really pushed us to how do you make things as concise as possible, and especially at the outset when there's so much you want or you feel like a reader needs to know to drop them into this unfamiliar world in 1960, but we got to get the story moving. And so they really pushed us. So my dad and I would talk a lot about how we were setting up these first chapters and how we were ending the book, and how much after the 9 days to share, and that was a real journey that the book benefited from, because our initial draft, really the editors didn't do too much editing. The first they just said, I think it should be about 3/5 as long. And so we had a lot of research discoveries that we were so proud of that we had to painfully cut away until the essential story that for a reader who is not as obsessed with these things as we might be, you're going to stay engaged all the way through, and hopefully all that was left is the essential story that's just really absorbing, and you're learning a lot, but they really pushed us on cutting the exposition, cutting stuff after the story. Let's make it move, and so their kind of tough direction that challenged us to do it and we made the choices, but they really said, no, this is going to be best as a real strong, tight thriller narrative. So figure that out.
I want to thank both of you for this outstanding presentation. It was really fun, really interesting, beautifully done. Thank you.
And thanks. I really appreciate that, Dick.
Thanks to all the Philsonians who are watching this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night.